Chapter 36, The Cold War Begins, 1945 to 1952. During the 1930s, the unemployment and insecurity had finally pushed the limits of the country. The economy was a mess, with prices elevating at least 33% after wartime price controls were removed. In 1947, the Republican Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act over President Truman's veto, and soon enough the Employment Act of 1946 began promoting maximum employment once again. The Sun Belt, which was a 15-state area stretching from Virginia all the way through Florida and Texas to Arizona and California, significantly increased the population at nearly double that of old industrial zones within the Northeast, referred to as the Frost Belt, while the industry region of the Ohio Valley was called the Rust Belt. Then, the Federal Housing Administration, as well as the Veterans Administration, made for many home loan guarantees that made it far easier in terms of economics. Also, the Big Three, consisting of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, all met in Yalta for the Yalta Conference, which discussed the after-effect plans as a result of World War II. Peacekeeping was created under new light known as the United Nations. Through such arms like UNESCO, otherwise known as the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, the FAO, known as the Food and Agricultural Organization, and also WHO, known as the World Health Organization, the United Nations brought major benefits to many all around the world. On March 12, 1947, President Truman came before Congress asking for support concerning the Truman Doctrine. He declared that it must be the policy of the United States to help any country that was battling communist hostility. And finally, in 1950, General MacArthur succeeded in pushing the North Koreans past the 38th parallel, but shortly after, by means of hordes upon hordes of communist Chinese volunteers, UN forces were pushed right back. Due to General MacArthur's defiance and divergence with the Joint Chiefs of Staff about increasing the size of the war, President Truman was forced to remove MacArthur from command in 1951. Chapter 37, The Eisenhower Era, 1952 to 1960. After Dwight D. Eisenhower won the election of 1952 by a large majority, he tried to end the Korean War, and in 1953 he threatened using nuclear weapons, and the armistice was signed, officially ending the Korean War. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white person on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. This generated a year-long black boycott of the city buses and served notice throughout the South that blacks would no longer submit quietly to the irrationalities and indignities of segregation. In the case Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, 1954, the Supreme Court governed that segregation in public schools was unequal and thus unconstitutional. The decision overturned the previous ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. States in the Deep South counteracted the decision, and more than 100 senators and congressmen signed the Declaration of Constitutional Principles in 1956, pledging their rigid opposition to desegregation. In 1957, Congress passed the first Civil Rights Act since Reconstruction days. It set up a perpetual Civil Rights Commission to investigate violations of civil rights and authorized federal commands to shield voting rights. In 1954, giving in to the Mexican government's worries that illegal Mexican immigration to the United States would weaken the Bracero program of legally imported farm workers, President Eisenhower rounded up 1 million illegal immigrants in Operation Wetback. Then, the Interstate Highway Act of 1956 was established, which created countless jobs and sped the suburbanization of America as 42,000 miles of highways were built. In the early 1950s, nationalist movements had sought to throw the French out of Indochina. The leaders of the Indochina countries, including Vietnam leader Ho Chi Minh, became progressively communist as America became gradually anti-communist. Also, concerning the Cold War, in 1960, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down in Russia, causing feelings of a possibly nonviolent resolve to diminish. Popular music and other increasingly popular innovations like the credit card, fast food, and new forms of reformation, especially televised/radio events, were harbingers of an evolving lifestyle. Chapter 38, The Stormy 60s, 1960 to 1968. President Kennedy was then met with the Soviet leader Khrushchev at Vienna in 1961, and after making numerous threats, the Soviets finally decided to act. In August 1961, the Soviets began to construct the Berlin Wall, which was designed to stop the large populous decline from East Germany to West Germany through Berlin. Concentrating on Western Europe, Kennedy protected the passageway of the Trade Expansion Act in 1962, approving tariff cuts of up to 50% to endorse trade with common market countries. The Bay of Pigs mistake pushed the Cuban leader further into the Soviet grip. In 1962, it was discovered that the Soviets were secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba. The American government also agreed to end the confinement and not assault the island. In late 1963, a pact barring nuclear explosions in the atmosphere was signed. Then, in 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. led thousands of black and white demonstrators on a nonviolent march on Washington in support of the projected new civil rights legislation. It also shaped the Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, to eradicate discrimination in hiring. Mounting the war on poverty, Congress doubled the backing of the Office of Economic Opportunity to $2 billion. In 1965 came Medicare for the elderly and Medicaid for the poor. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 eliminated the quota system that had been in place since 1921. It also doubled the number of immigrants permitted to enter the country yearly. The basis of immigration loosened from Europe to Latin America and Asia. Finally, in 1965, President Johnson sent thousands of troops to the Dominican Republic to return order after an uprising against the military government began. Johnson claimed, with shaky evidence, that the Dominican Republic was the target of a Castro-like revolution. He was widely reprimanded for his actions. Chapter 39, The Stalemated 70s, 1968 to 1980. President Nixon's announced policy called Vietnamization was to extract U.S. troops in South Vietnam over an extensive period of time. The Nixon Doctrine proclaimed that the United States would honor its existing defense commitments, but in the future, Asians and others would have to fight for their own wars without the aid of American troops. Nixon delivered a televised speech to the silent majority who presumably supported the war. He hoped to gain supporters. Also, in 1971, the 26th Amendment was approved, dropping the voting age to 18. The two great communist powers, the Soviet Union and China, were clashing bitterly over their rival interpretations of Marxism. Nixon took advantage of this valuable opportunity to acquire the help of both by playing the antagonist, hoping to eventually force Vietnam into a more peaceful disposition. 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Act, demanding the President to report all assurances of U.S. troops to foreign exchanges within 48 hours. A unique feeling of new isolationism that discouraged U.S. troops to other countries began to take hold, but Nixon held his ground. Later, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, lifted the embargo in 1974, yet intensely magnified the price of oil. This era involved the 1974 Supreme Court ruling in Milliken v. Bradley that desegregation plans could not require students to move across school district lines. This strengthened the white flight that pitted the poorest whites and blacks against each other, frequently with destructively fierce results. Late in July 1974, the House permitted its first article of impeachment for hindering justice. Nixon resigned after realizing that he would definitely be convicted if impeached, including the Watergate scandal. America's defeat in Vietnam resulted in a loss of self-worth, loss of sureness in military power, and loss of much of the economic strength that had made possible its global leadership after World War II. Finally, during the Iranian hostage crisis, the American hostages languished in cruel captivity, while news reports showed images of Iranian mobs burning the American flag and spitting on effigies of Uncle Sam. Carter first attempted economic authorizations to force the release of the hostages, but this failed. He then tried a commando rescue mission, but that had to be terminated. When two military aircraft crashed, 8 of the would-be rescuers were killed. The stalemate hostage situation dragged on for most of Carter's term, and the hostages were never released until January 20th, 1981, the day of Ronald Reagan's inauguration. Chapter 40, The Resurgence of Conservatism, 1980 to 2000. Conservative Ronald Reagan became president in 1981 and then crushingly won a second term with the election of 1984. And soon enough, the Supreme Court began to really hone in on the cultural wars taking place. For instance, there was the issue of abortion rising, which constituted most importantly of the Roe v. Wade case in 1973, where the court had banned states from making laws that inhibited with a woman's right to an abortion during the early months of pregnancy. While it was not completely overturned, it was greatly compromised due to Webster v. Reproductive Health Services. During his second term, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union grew when a Korean passenger plane was blown up by the Soviets. The Cold War deepened when all arms control negotiations stopped. Tensions in the Middle East as well as Central America also grew. When Gorbachev took over as leader of the Soviet Union, talks began and they signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces INF Treaty. The stock market crash on October 19, 1987 was labeled Black Monday. Banks were going under and the federal rescue operation was estimated to cost over $500 billion. George H.W. Bush became the 41st president in 1989. The Cold War era ended by 1989 once the Berlin Wall came down. The Soviet Union was dissolved and became 15 separate independent states. Defense cutbacks affected the economy with rising unemployment due to many military bases closing. In 1991, the United States headed a United Nations of the Persian Gulf. Bush signed the American Disabilities Act 88 in 1990 and a Civil Rights Bill in 1991. Chapter 41, America Confronts the Post-Cold War Era, 1992 to 2004. In August 1991, a military coup attempted to preserve the communist system by trying to dislodge Gorbachev from power. With support of Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, one of the several republics that composed the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, Gorbachev thwarted the plotters. Lots of bombings took place after this, including the World Trade Center, so distrust of the government became apparent. Clinton committed American troops to NATO to keep the peace in the former Yugoslavia, and he sent thousands of troops to return Jean-Bertrand Aristide to power in Haiti. Later, Clinton took control and fully supported the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, that made a free trade zone surrounding Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. He then assisted to form the World Trade Organization, the inheritor to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. The end of the Cold War left the U.S. floundering for a diplomatic plan to replace anti-communism and revealed misconduct by the CIA and the FBI. Lastly, he also provided $20 billion to Mexico in 1995 to help its irresolute economy. George H.W. Bush championed the No Child Left Behind Act in 2002, and the constant turbulence in Iraq continued as well. He then cultivated the full-scale embryonic stem cell research and calling for a constitutional amendment banning gay marriage. He was then reelected. Chapter 42, The American People Face a New Century. The task of purging the earth of ample pollutants was one crucial mission confronting the U.S. people. Another was seeking ways to resolve ethnic and cultural struggles once erupted around the world's end of the Cold War. All at the same time, more gates were opening for the U.S. people, opportunities in outer space and inner city streets, artist easel, and the musician's concert hall at the inventor's bench and the scientist's laboratory. The everlasting quest for social justice, individual fulfillment, and international peace will continue in times to come.